It was nestled 1,400 kilometers away from Ukraine, an untouchable super missile that Ukraine would never be able to find, and even if it did, it would never be able to hit. Putin was confident, overconfident in fact. The untouchable weapon was indeed found, and once it was, Ukraine did what it does best: obliterate it. With the weapon erased, Putin has been left asking himself how Ukraine pulled off the attack when it was supposed to never have long-range capabilities in the first place. Something that Putin thought could never exist just hit Russia hard. Once again, Putin has been proven wrong. We head to the Voktinsk machine-building plant, located in Russia's Udmurt Republic, which has already been sanctioned by practically every major Western nation as well as a few others. The US, UK, Australia, Japan, Ukraine, and Switzerland all have this plant on their sanctions list, as does the European Union. And there's a very good reason why. The plant, which is 1,400 kilometers or about 870 miles away from Ukraine, is one of the most important cogs in Russia's missile-making machine. That's why it's located so far away from Ukraine and the rest of Europe. Putin has been trying to hide the plant away, hoping that sheer distance alone will be enough to protect it from being struck as hard by Ukraine's flying sanctions as it has been by the more traditional economic ones. On February 21st, a report by The Telegraph revealed that this supposedly untouchable plant had become the latest victim of a Ukrainian strike. The outlet reports that Ukraine's general staff has confirmed an attack on the Voktinsk machine-building plant using FP-5 Flamingo drone hybrid missiles. The attack, which appears to have devastated the facility, is a strike that Putin never thought would happen and certainly didn't see coming, as we'll explain a little later in the video. But as Ukraine's Flamingo drone missiles flew, the reality was brought home to Russia and the people who live near the untouchable plant. Footage from locals circulated on Russian Telegram channels showed windows shattered in nearby buildings and a huge fire raging, with smoke billowing from the territory of the plant, The Telegraph reports. The regional head of the Udmurt Republic, Alexander Brechelov, was even forced to confirm that Ukraine had struck, which is a rare break from Russia's usual approach of pretending that anything that Ukraine hits was actually just a casualty of drone debris caused by Russia's supposedly stellar air defenses. There was no denying what Ukraine's Flamingos managed to pull off, though. The Voktinsk plant is now in flames, and there are a couple of big reasons why Ukraine targeted this plant: how it's grown and what it makes. On the growth side of things, the Voktinsk plant has managed to expand even when weighed down by sanctions. As the Kyiv Independent reveals in its report on Ukraine's strike, the plant is state-owned and has grown massively since Putin launched his invasion. Thousands of new workers have been hired and new buildings have been constructed. Russia has also been able to import advanced machinery to the plant despite sanctions. An investigation conducted by the Kyiv Independent found that the likes of China, Belarus, and Taiwan have all sold supplies to the plant, which were funneled through third parties to evade sanctions, to enable Russia to carry out this expansion. For Ukraine, this was an example of sanctions either not being enforced or not being strong enough to stop Russia from doing what they want to do. So Ukraine took the situation into its own hands with a weapon that Putin thought would never exist. As for what the plant makes, there's a big reason why locals are reporting that Ukraine specifically targeted two of the plant's workshops. Two reasons, in fact, and they can be summed up in two words: Iskander-M and Oreshnik. The Voktinsk facility is one of Russia's most important, as it produces solid-fuel ballistic missiles. The Telegraph reports that the Iskander-M, which is a short-range ballistic missile system that Russia has used in many of its attacks against Ukraine, is made at the plant. It's also believed that Russia is building the nuclear-capable and hypersonic Oreshnik Mobile Intermediate-Range Ballistic Missile, or IRBM, that Putin claims is an unstoppable weapon that can travel at 10 times the speed of sound. Both of these missiles are massive threats to Ukraine. The Iskander-M is road mobile and has a range of up to 500 kilometers or about 310 miles, according to Missile Defense Advocacy. That means that Russia can launch the missile from inside its own territory or from deep in the rear of the occupied territories of Ukraine. The missile can carry both nuclear and conventional warheads, though Russia has of course only used the conventional so far in Ukraine. Even so, the 700 kilograms or about 1,540 pounds of firepower that can be packed into the Iskander-M is more than enough to do serious damage to whatever it strikes. We saw that on February 21st, which is when the New Voice of Ukraine reported on a Russian attack on Ukraine that included 120 drones and an Iskander-M missile. Though 106 of the 120 drones were neutralized, the Iskander-M struck. Ukraine needs to take this missile out of Russia's arsenal. Taking out the key production facility responsible for making it is the best way to do that. As for Oreshnik, that is even more dangerous than the Iskander-M, assuming you believe the Russian propaganda around the missile. Beyond the claims of the missile being hypersonic to the degree that it can hit Mach 10, it's also estimated to have a range of between 3,500 and 5,470 kilometers, or about 2,170 and almost 3,400 miles, according to Missile Threat. Like the Iskander-M, Oreshnik is road mobile, and even at the lower end of its estimated range would pose a massive threat not only to Ukraine, but also to practically all of Europe. Missile Threat says that Russia's hypersonic weapon can carry 6 MIRV warheads, with each being capable of deploying 6 submunitions for a total of 36 submunitions that could strike with every Oreshnik launch. Russia has used it against Ukraine before, albeit only a handful of times. The most recent of those times came in January, when they targeted the city of Lviv with an Oreshnik missile after having previously hit Dnipro. Isolated though these launches were, they served as a clear warning to Ukraine that it needed to hit what Putin thought was untouchable. By taking out Oreshnik, Ukraine eliminated one of the biggest threats that Russia has, and now that the Vokhinsk factory is burning, it's clear that Ukraine is on a mission to take Oreshnik down at its source. The super missile has been taken down. And we're going to explain why Putin thought that would never happen in just a few minutes. But before we do, the destruction of workshops at Vokhinsk isn't the only thing that Ukraine managed to achieve in its most recent aerial strikes against Russia. As the Telegraph reports, Ukraine also managed to strike the Neftogorsk gas processing plant, which is based in Russia's Samara region. On top of that, Ukraine also struck against Russian facilities in the occupied portion of Donetsk, scoring direct hits on a drone workshop and a lubricants warehouse. As has been the case with all of Ukraine's long-range strikes, what we see here is Ukraine's strategy of weakening the Russian war machine from the inside. Let's come back to the Vokhinsk attack. When providing details about Ukraine's strike, Brechelov would only say that the missile manufacturing plant had been struck by drones. He didn't say what kind, and frankly, he has undersold what Ukraine pulled off in the Udmurt Republic. Ukraine's latest strike was made possible because the Flamingo drone missile hybrid has once again taken flight, and it's proven itself to be more than a match for the facilities that make some of the most terrifying missiles in Russia's arsenal. Capable of flying up to 3,000 kilometers, or a little over 1,860 miles, and packing a 1,150 kilogram or around a 2,530 pound warhead, the Flamingo is a hybrid between drone and missile that is terrifying for Russia. It combines all of the best features of a cruise missile, especially when it comes to range and power, with those of a drone. And as the International Institute for Strategic Studies notes, the Flamingo reflects a wider trend of low-cost cruise missile designs emerging from OWA UAV deployment. Systems such as Ukraine's Ruta and Angeril's Barracuda have been developed by organizations with a background in UAV development rather than missile development. And that new form of development is what worries Putin most. In the mind of Russia's leader, a weapon like Flamingo was never supposed to exist, but it does. And before we dig deeper into that subject, this is just a quick side note to remind you that you are watching The Military Show. If you want more of this kind of insight, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Now, the long-range problem that Russia thought it would never have. When Putin launched his invasion, Ukraine wasn't in much of a position to do much damage against Russia in terms of strikes on Russian territory. That's revealed by Fabian Hoffman of Missile Matters, who says that Ukraine's missile arsenal in 2022 was mostly made up of Soviet-era weapons that Russia understood and for which it had counters. Ukraine has started developing some missiles of its own, most notably the R-360 Neptune anti-ship missile. But that has only been delivered to Ukraine's Navy in 2021, and at least in Putin's mind, it wouldn't have made much of a difference anyway. Neptune might hit a ship in the Black Sea here and there, but it wasn't a missile that Ukraine could use to do damage to Russia on its own turf. Putin also believed that Ukraine would struggle to build on what it had, as Hoffman explains. Structural constraints in Ukraine's missile industry were significant. Deep historical dependence on Russian components and markets, sharply disrupted after 2014, and only partially substituted by 2022, Hoffman says. For Putin, this essentially translated to Ukraine not having the infrastructure to build weapons that could strike Russia, even if it had some of the most brilliant technical minds from the former Soviet Union. Still, Russia took steps to destroy what there was of Ukraine's missile industry. The first year of Putin's invasion saw Russia carry out strikes against Ukraine's missile production plants, such as the Pivda Marsh strike in Dnipro back in November 2022. Combine strikes like these with Putin's arrogant assumption that Ukraine wouldn't be able to build up its long-range capabilities before Russia overran the country, and you get a recipe for Putin believing that Oreshnik and its ilk were untouchable. Putin was so unconcerned about Ukraine's domestic long-range capabilities that he switched his focus to the West. Ukraine started receiving some weapons from Western partners such as Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles from the UK and France, along with ATACMS missiles from the US. Powerful though they are, these weapons can't strike too deeply into Russia. Storm Shadow has a range of about 250 kilometers or around 155 miles, with ATACMS offering a little more range at 300 kilometers or about 186 miles. Dangerous for sure, but more of a threat to the border regions of Russia and the ships in the Black Sea than anywhere else. All Putin would have to do is make sure that missile plants like Voktinsk were positioned out of range of Ukraine's Western weapons, and Russia would be fine to build whatever it wanted. We now know that Putin was wrong. Russia's leader made the mistake of underestimating Ukraine yet again, and he assumed that Russia's most valuable missile facilities were untouchable. As Putin lambasted the West for providing long-range missiles to Ukraine, he failed to do anything about Ukraine building its own long-range weapons. Arrogance came before the fall for Putin, as his focus on the West meant that Ukraine was able to build weapons like the Flamingo, along with the many long-range weapons that came before it, without Russia stopping it. Why would Russia even try? Putin believed that weapons like the one that just struck the Voktinsk facility would never exist. By the end of 2023, Ukraine had started showing hints that it intended to scale up domestic missile and long-range weapon production. The country's hand was somewhat forced as Ukraine realized that some of the Western weapons that it hoped to receive, such as the German-made Taurus, weren't coming. And even those that Ukraine was getting, especially the ATACMS, came with restrictions on where and how Ukraine could use them. In fact, it wasn't until November 2024 that the US gave Ukraine permission to strike limited locations on Russian territory with ATACMS. With all of these factors at play, Ukraine just kept on working. By the end of 2024, Hoffman reports, Ukraine was in a position where it could build its own long-range drones and some mini-cruise missiles. The signs were all there that more was coming, but Putin ignored them. He was still arrogant in his belief that no matter what Ukraine built, it wouldn't be able to hit Russia's most valuable assets. By August of 2025, Ukraine was fielding a host of long-range drones such as the Lyuchi and FP-1, and they were doing massive damage to Russian oil refineries and other targets. Still, Putin did nothing. Sure, there were now drones flying over Russian territory practically every week, but most only had small payloads. It wasn't like Ukraine had a missile-like weapon that could do tons of damage, but Ukraine was getting there, despite what Putin thought and claimed. By the end of 2025, the Flamingo was ready to go. In 2026, we've already seen Ukraine use it several times to take out key Russian targets, including another site related to Oreshnik that we'll reveal at the end of the video. Finally, with Flamingo taking flight, Putin woke up to the fact that Ukraine was producing weapons capable of hitting what he once believed were untouchable targets in Russia. Putin tried to stop it. According to the military analyst, Russia expended considerable resources to figure out where the Flamingo was being built, and once it did, Russia carried out a strike against the drone missiles' production facilities. The outlet claims that Russia used Oreshnik for this attack. Regardless, it didn't work, as Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky reported in mid-February, production of Flamingo has continued despite the Russian strike. The Voktinsk missile production facility is just the latest victim of a weapon that Putin thought could never exist. There will be many more. As the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, notes, the flight of the Flamingo means serious trouble has come Russia's way. From the Russian standpoint, the future looks worrying. If and when such a missile capability is deployed, Ukraine's long-range strike campaign will increase in intensity, likely to the detriment of Russia's critical oil and gas infrastructure, which is already struggling under Ukraine's persistent attacks using existing capabilities, CEPA says. It appears that this is an underestimation of Ukraine's capabilities, which is a common theme in the story. Ukraine will be hitting oil and gas facilities, sure, but with the use of Flamingo against a facility that builds Iskander-M and Oreshnik missiles, we're seeing far more ambition in Ukraine's approach than Putin could have expected. Ukraine's work on its long-range arsenal has paid off. Now it can hit more targets inside Russia than ever before. So what does all of this mean for the future of the Ukraine war? For one, there's no denying that the timing of Ukraine's attack on the Voktinsk plant was symbolic in terms of its timing. The news of the strike broke very soon after the latest rounds of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine broke down. Held in Geneva over the course of a couple of days, the talks ended on February 18th, again without any kind of breakthrough. Still, Russia demands that Ukraine cede territory. With its latest Flamingo attack, Ukraine has dispelled the Russian narrative that it's on the verge of defeat. If anything, Ukraine is in a position to weaken Russia more than it ever has before, and the ruining of Russia's ability to build some of its most important missiles is a perfect example of that. UATV adds an interesting point in its report on Ukraine's Flamingo strike. It says that Russia responded with yet another long-range attack on Ukraine. Only, as is often the case with Russia's strikes, The country targeted predominantly civilian rather than military targets. However, Putin may have slipped up this time around. In addition to his usual targets, Russia also apparently hit a production building owned by the American company Mondelez International. That could be a problem for Putin. The facility represents one of America's first major investments in Ukraine following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and if UATV is correct, Russia's strike against the facility was very deliberate. Perhaps Putin is panicking over Flamingo and Ukraine's growing long-range arsenal. If he is, then striking Western businesses in Ukraine is far from the sort of decision that will calm the panic down. How can Moscow talk about economic dialogue with the United States while attacking American production facilities? UATV asks. It's an interesting question, and it will be interesting to see how the US responds and what impact this strike will have on America's treatment of Russia in future peace talks. As for Ukraine, it's going to keep on pushing with its long-range strategy. The weapons that Putin never thought would exist are here, and Ukraine isn't going to stop there. Evolution of its aerial tactics is on Ukraine's agenda, meaning that Flamingo is a starting point rather than the end goal. Ukraine has also built other missiles and missile-like weapons such as Long Neptune and Palyantsia, which it's using to strike Russian territory. ATACMS and Storm Shadow are now in play, and Flamingo's production is ongoing. As the Voktinsk factory burns, Putin will be asking just how many more of Russia's supposedly untouchable assets are now under threat. Russia's leader won't like the answer. It's a lot more than he ever imagined could be. And to prove that, you may remember that we told you that Ukraine had struck another Oreshnik-related facility earlier in the video. That attack came before Ukraine's strike on Russia's missile-making factory, and it was yet more proof that Ukraine has proven Putin wrong with its long-range strategy. Do you want to learn more about that strike? Well, check out our video to find out what Ukraine did to cripple Oreshnik just a few weeks before its latest attack. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more analysis of Ukraine's ever-evolving strategy against Russia. And thank you as always for watching.